the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Something fishy about miracles. Let's hear the Word of God. I heard this story recently. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him." Then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the young child, and when you have found him, bring back word to me that I may come and worship him also." When they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. One of the interesting elements of the Christmas story is what we just read, what's called the Star of Bethlehem, that leads the Magi, members of a priestly caste trained in astrology probably from Persia. They see a star in the sky, it brings them to Bethlehem, and once they're there in Judea, they see the star again, and now comes and leads them into Bethlehem, and it stands right over the house where Jesus is. And this past Christmas, something interesting came up. Actually, it was early December. When we had the news that Jupiter and Saturn were going to converge on December 21st, was this the biblical Star of Bethlehem? That's right, folks. A planetary conjunction was coming where Jupiter and Saturn would be lined up with Earth in such a way that they'll make a very, very bright light in the sky. And there was this attempt to say that science could explain what the Star of Bethlehem really was, because this conjunction that was going to happen this year has actually happened a number of times before. And for quite a number of centuries, scholars have suggested that the Star of Bethlehem may actually have been a great conjunction of bright planets. Even Johannes Kepler, the discovery of planetary motion, made that suggestion, or Copernicus, perhaps. But the attempt of trying to find a scientific explanation is not new. From a few years back, the Star of Bethlehem was no star. Wise men may have followed rare alignment of planets. Astrophysicists suggest that in this case. And what's he talking about? According to the story, the Magi told Herod of the sign they had seen. They saw something again. Hugh's best explanation for this series of events is something known as a triple conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn, coming close together in the sky 3 times over a short period. So in other words, they lined up and they did it 3 times across a short period, explaining the various appearances of the star. And again, from the BBC, was the Star of Bethlehem a planetary conjunction? One of the more popular theories was a series of conjunctions between Jupiter and Saturn in 7 BC. From that year, Jupiter and Saturn met not once, but 3 times that year, May, September, December. The first conjunction, visible in the east before the sunrise, presumably started the Magi on their way to Bethlehem. The middle conjunction may have strengthened their resolve, while the third and final conjunction, December 5th, occurred just as they arrived in Judea, who sent them on to Bethlehem to go and search diligently for the young child. It's an interesting idea. I remember attending a Christmas Eve service at a church some years back, and the pastor there brought in a fellow who made a presentation in which he argued for this sort of explanation. He had a detailed PowerPoint based on the astronomy. And after he was finished, the pastor actually said, "I'm so happy to hear this. I can finally believe this story. I'm so happy to hear this scientific explanation. I can finally believe this story." There's a couple of problems here. First of all, it doesn't work. We see that the star went before them until it came and stood over where the young child was. Well, a planetary conjunction can't do that. Whatever this was, it must have been able to direct people to a very, very specific location, actually standing over a house. It's one reason the planetary conjunction is a problem. And in fact, it's recognized by these same people who write these articles, who suggest it's a planetary conjunction. But after suggesting that, this writer points out that actually leads them to Bethlehem. It's this making a sharp left turn. It's standing over a house. He says, The star is said to stop in place and hover over a particular lodging, acting as an ancient GPS unit. The description of the movements of the star, he noted, was outside what is physically possible for any observable astronomical object. So it wasn't a planetary conjunction. That's a problem. In fact, the star cannot normally do what happened here. And yet the Bible tells us it was a star, so what do we do with it? Well, the writer of this article says this: in light of such traditions, I believe Matthew's story of the star exists not to inform readers, but to support claims that he is making about the character of Jesus. I argue that Matthew's goal in telling this story is more theological than it is historical. Well, if a star can't do that, he says, well, then it didn't really happen. Either there's a scientific explanation or we should think it didn't happen. Okay, and it may not be so surprising to see this in a secular newspaper, but what about that pastor I mentioned earlier? He intimated that he could not believe the story in the Bible unless there was scientific explanation to it. And so we get this dichotomy. There is a scientific explanation, so we can believe it. There's no scientific explanation, so we cannot believe it. And those are your choices. Folks, this is what is known in logic as a false dichotomy. A false dichotomy posits two and only two possible answers to a question, and you have to pick one of them, when in fact, in reality, there's at least one more. What's the other possible explanation here? Very simply, it was a miracle. Miracles cannot be explained by science and do not need to be explained by science. So why is it that so many people, including professing Christians, have trouble accepting miracles? Dr. Clegg Blomberg, one of our rock star scholars, highly respected evangelical community, speaking about Jonah, says, we do not have to accept the seemingly outlandish, grotesque, and perhaps unnecessary miracle about Jonah being swallowed by a great fish. What's in the Bible? Jesus used it as a sign of himself, but our scholar tells us, well, don't really have to believe this miracle. Even this normally reliable, at least on scientific creationism, this normally reliable organization, when it comes to the alleged starlight problem, poo-poos the idea of God having done a miracle here. He says one option, the last option, is that it's a miracle, but he tells us that, well, this hypothesis is untestable and seems implausible. Implausible that God would do a miracle. It's untestable. And then he comes up, his own suggestion, which itself is untestable, where he tries to wed the account to secular science so that he ends up with an Earth. Is it really a maximum 7,686 years as the ministry defends? Well, depends on what clock you're using. Just as accurate to say it's 13.77 billion years. All depends on where you're standing. All that to avoid miracle here. One of Jesus' best known miracles is the feeding of the 5,000 in Matthew 14, Mark 6, Luke 9, and John 6. It's one of the very, very few that actually mentioned in all four gospel books. There's a hungry crowd, and the only food available to them is a boy who has 5 loaves and 2 fish. And Jesus multiplies that into enough food for a crowd of 5,000 men, plus women, plus children, and has 12 baskets left over. Well, this is obviously a miracle. This is an example of creating out of nothing, creation ex nihilo, a genuine miracle. I heard a United Church pastor who put it this way. He said, well, actually, everybody did bring enough food for themselves, but they were hiding it because they didn't want to share. And so it just looked like there was no food. But when this young boy goes up and he offers his loaves and fish, and he brings it out, all the people are just so touched that they bring out their food from under their robes and they start sharing it. And so everybody has enough. That's the actual miracles. Everybody just is moved to be generous. An outright denial that anything truly miraculous happened here. And we have to ask why. Why this reluctance to accept the reality of miracles? Well, the hugely influential early 20th century liberal Old Testament scholar Rudolph Braum put it this way: we cannot use electric lights and radios and, in the event of illness, avail ourselves of modern medical and clinical means and at the same time believe in the spirit and wonder world of the New Testament. And again, It is impossible to repristinate a past world picture by sheer resolve, especially a mythical world picture, now that all of our thinking is irrevocably formed by science. A blind acceptance of New Testament mythology would be simply arbitrariness. To make such acceptance a demand of faith would be to reduce faith to a work. And there you have it. They think science has disproven miracles. Interestingly, most of those who think science has disproven miracles simply do not understand science. They just don't. In fact, science has not and cannot disprove miracles. The idea that it can, or the idea that it does so, is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of science. What is science? If you ask these people for a definition, most of them wouldn't be able to. They just look at you funny, go, blah, blah, blah. You wouldn't know. What it is a way of studying the natural world that grew out of the Christian belief that God made an orderly universe that reveals his handiwork and so can and should be studied. Thinking God's thoughts after him, as one early scientist put it. The world normally, day to day, operates according to certain fixed processes. And they're described by the laws that we've discovered. It all begins with observation. Stand there and look at the stars and planets. You could mix chemicals in a test tube. You begin with observation. You look at what happens in the world around us. You look for things that always happen in the same way under the same conditions. When you find phenomena that always happens in the same way under the same conditions, you identify them as laws. And that is the laws of nature, the laws of science. For example, drop a ball and it falls. And has a certain acceleration downwards. And you do it again and the same thing happens. You do it 1,000,000 times. It does it every single time. It never decides to turn curlicues and fly to the moon. Every single time, eventually you realize that it always does that thing. And bing, you have the law of gravity. It's a description of one of the ways in which the world normally acts. These are ongoing natural processes. But this is all that science can study and learn about. Science can only study and learn about ongoing natural processes. You need to understand that this is a subset of knowledge. It does not cover all valid knowledge. It doesn't and cannot touch upon events that are not ongoing natural processes, such as, for example, history. You cannot scientifically prove that John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln in 1865. You cannot scientifically prove that Caesar crossed the Rubicon, and you cannot scientifically prove that the Hungarians defeated the invading Muslim armies at Nándorfehérvár in 1456. But these are all facts of history. It's just as valid as anything science tells us. That's easy to prove. If I asked you, where were you born? What would you tell me? Yeah, born in Toronto. I was born in Montreal. I was born in Hong Kong. I was born in Taiwan. How could you prove that scientifically? Absolutely not. It's a historical event. You can only prove it through history. You could show me your birth certificate. But you know what? That's a historical document signed by an eyewitness. So not everything that we know is a matter of science. So we go back to miracles. What is a miracle? Here's the thing. The world normally operates according to ongoing natural processes that God built into the world he created. And we have to ask ourselves, can he override those natural laws when he chooses to do so? Well, to ask that is to answer it. He is all powerful and he built the world, so of course he can override any law whenever he chooses to do so. So this then is a remarkably stupid statement. Scientific discoveries in no way speak against miracles. Absolutely not. Now, sometimes, God does use natural forces to accomplish miracles. He will use them, but he will control them in a way that isn't natural. For example, we see when God led the Israelites out of Egypt under Moses. And you remember that they're at the shore of the Dead Sea and they're trapped. Pharaoh's army is coming to exterminate them. And what happens? Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. So the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on the dry ground, and the waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. In this case, parting the Red Sea so the Israelites could escape, God used a natural force, the wind, but he controlled it to do what he wanted, which is to actually fully separate the water so that the Israelites could travel across dry land. What about this miracle? When Jesus turned water into wine, what sort of miracle would that be? It will be a transmutation. He would actually have had to rearrange atomic structure for the various ingredients. What about if we forget all the other things in wine? What about if we forget the flavonoids, the vitamins, and so on? We look only at the most basic idea of water and 12% ethanol. Surprisingly, you can actually do scientific calculations on that, and it's being done. Assume that the only other element you need is carbon. You can get that from the air. You can start doing enthalpy and entropy calculations on the process. Assuming Jesus is able to provide the perfect catalyst to the reaction, making activation energy unnecessary. Well, okay, what does he find out? The researchers then determined the extra energy required for turning water into wine, finding that Jesus would have had to instantaneously input more than 250,000 kilojoules, roughly half the amount of energy in an average lightning bolt, into the system for it to work. The conclusion, it must have been a miracle. And then going back to this one, the feeding of the 5,000. Okay? This is an actual creation miracle. It can't be done. That's your first law of thermodynamics. First law, one of the most fundamental laws of science, is that matter energy cannot be created or destroyed. So how could Jesus have created bread and fish out of nothing? How? This is why your United Church minister doesn't want to believe the account. Well, actually, the first law of thermodynamics is this: matter energy cannot be created or destroyed by any natural process. Again, science cannot address the issue of miracles. Science can just tell you, could this happen without a miracle? We're talking here about God, who is not a natural process. Of course, he can create. In fact, what science actually proves, if we think about it, if we understand the laws of science, is that miracles must have happened. Exactly because the laws of science tell us that matter energy cannot be created or destroyed, yet it is here. It could only have come about by a miracle, by an act of a creator. So if he could create all this, are we supposed to believe that's difficult for him to create some bread and fish? Really? What about this? If you think that God, who made the billions upon billions of stars in space, so many we can't count them, this many stars in space, would it really have been difficult for him to create one tiny ball of glowing gases, giving off light perhaps by nuclear fusion reactions, a tiny one, giving off radiation of visible light and containing its radiation while using it to guide the Magi to one specific house? Of course, why could he not do that? We don't need to find a planetary conjunction. The text tells us it was a star. That's what it was. And that's well within God's capabilities to do. Do you think the God who made the heavens and the earth and all things in them could have whipped up some extra food? Ex nihilo, out of nothing? I think so. Included fish, and that's about the only thing fishy about miracles, is every once in a while they involve fish. Nothing else is fishy about them. Every once in a while they're about fish. Oh, which, by the way, brings us back to Craig Blomberg. We do not have to accept the seemingly outlandish, grotesque, and perhaps unnecessary miracle about Jonah being swallowed by a great fish. I wonder what it means by unnecessary. It's like our good doctor will tell God, oh, you didn't need to do that. It wasn't necessary. Grotesque, outlandish. Jonah being swallowed by a great fish. So are we to think that God, who created all these multiple types of fish, this is just a very few of them, countless different types of fish, really he couldn't make one swallow a man? Even though there are historical examples of fish swallowing people? I think he could. This is another fishy miracle, but again, fishy only because it includes a fish, not because there's anything strange about it. So is that really outlandish, grotesque, unnecessary? I don't think so. Now, no doubt, Blomberg does believe in the miracle of Jesus' resurrection. But this is kind of strange, you see, because The miracle accounts in the Bible are not a buffet where you can go in and pick and choose which ones to believe. They're a package deal. The same Bible that tells us Jesus rose from the dead is the one that tells us that a fish swallowed Jonah, and that Jesus multiplied enough food, 5 loaves and 2 fish, and enough food to feed thousands of people. It's the same one that tells us about the Star of Bethlehem. So it seems very, very strange that people are so reluctant to believe in miracles. And we have to ask why. Why do so many people not believe in miracles? And I think it's because a God who can do miracles can interfere with your life. And they don't want that. And so miracles are a logical corollary to the existence of God. Now, think about this, folks. If the world only operates according to natural laws, and God is on the outside just looking in, might be knocking and trying to get our attention, but can't do anything in our world. Because, laws of science, right? He can't do anything. Well, guess what? Then he's impotent. He can't judge us. He can't discipline us. We can be as nasty as we want to be. You can be as nasty as you want to be if there are no miracles, because God can't do anything. And that, I think, is exactly what's behind the unbeliever's desire to deny miracles. It's an interesting book that came out not that long ago. And do notice that forward is by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the famous Anglican Archbishop. It's called A God That Could Be Real. And in the descriptive literature, it says many people are fed up with the way traditional religion alienates them, perpetuates conflict, vilifies science, and undermines reason. Nancy Abrams, a philosopher of science, lawyer, and lifelong atheist, is among them. But she has also found freedom in imagining a higher power. Understand, this lady is an atheist. And she's going to imagine a God that could be real, however. An omniscient, omnipotent God that created the universe and plans what happens is incompatible with science, which, by the way, as we've seen, is an absolute lie. But this doesn't preclude a God that can comfort and empower us. Abrams finds something worthy of the name God in the new science of emergence. Just as a complex anthill emerges from the collective behavior of individually clueless ants, and just as the global economy emerges from the interactions of billions of individuals' choices, God, she argues, is an emergent phenomenon that arises from the staggering complexity of humanity's collective aspiration. So you see that to these people, the only God who could be real is the one who cannot put any demands on you, any requirements on you, make you do anything, judge you. The only God who could be real, ironically, is the idol that you make up for yourself for comfort and empowerment, but not one who has any power, not who's omnipotent, not who creates, the only one who has no power and can make no demands on you. And so we've come full circle back to making idols out of our own imagination. That's the unbelievers. Now, there are Christians also, as we've seen, Christians who fall into this trap. Not all the way. They don't deny all the miracles, but they have trouble with some of them. And we wonder why. Why are Christians doing this? And I'm afraid that they have forgotten this. What we're warned about very clearly, O Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust, avoiding profane and vain babblings and oppositions of science, falsely so called, which some professing have erred concerning the faith. Isn't that interesting? We're warned almost 2,000 years ago about science falsely so called. And believe me, things like evolution is science falsely so called. They've forgotten that and become easily misled. And largely because very, very few of them seem to have any formal training in science. What they actually understand about science could probably be written on the back of a postage stamp. And it makes it very easy for them to be misled, even though they were warned almost 2,000 years ago. But it's important, folks. Do remember what happens when we start denying miracles. Read this account when Jesus went back to his hometown. Then he went out from there and came to his own country, and his disciples followed him. And when the Sabbath had come, he began to teach in the synagogue. And many hearing him were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get these things? And what wisdom is this which is given to him that such mighty works are performed by his hands? Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" So they were offended at him. But Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his own country, among his own relatives, and in his own house. How he could do no mighty work there except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them, and he marveled because of their unbelief. It's not that he couldn't do it ontologically. It was a self-limitation. Jesus always and only did miracles for the purpose of advancing people in their faith. If you look through the gospel books carefully, you'll find that. Miracles are never done just for the sake of doing miracles. They're always done either as a sign or, in most cases, to advance people in the faith. These people rejected him out of hand. There was no faith there. It was not even possible to move them ahead in faith. And so by his own self-limitation, Jesus would not do any mighty works for them, except he laid his hands on a few sick people. There were a few there who believed. But for the rest of them, nothing. What a shame. When you refuse to believe God can do miracles, don't expect any. Don't let anyone rob you of this reality, that God can do miracles and he can do miracles in your life. Don't let anyone rob you of that. Not the professing Christians, not the atheists and unbelievers, according to whom the God who could be real, the God who could be real is the one who cannot do anything. We know that the God who is real is the one that wrote this. Let's remember that this God can and does do miracles, and let's stop trying to explain them away.
If you enjoy our content and think this is important material, the best compliment you can pay is by sharing this with your friends and family. This helps us out a lot. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We would love to hear from you. Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. We would love to hear from you. Please feel free to share any questions or comments you may have. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, MeWe, and YouTube. Simply search Truth in My Days as one word. Again, Truth in My Days as one word, no spaces in between. And you can connect with us. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.